So thanks for having me. I'm really excited to speak to everyone here, and I really enjoyed the meeting so far. I was starting to, it seemed like there was a lot of overlap between what I'll be talking about today and what Björn was just talking about. Unfortunately, I missed most of his talk, so, but I think there's a bit of overlap here. And what I'm interested in talking to you about today is sort of the relationship between kinematics of delta distributary networks and the sort of 3D architecture and how connected sand bodies are in the subsurface related to that. And this is part of a collaborative project that is kind of near its tail end, working with Chris Paola and Austin Chadwick, who are in Minnesota, Paolo Paslacqua and Jay Hariharan, who are in Austin and are computer modelers, mostly numerical modeling, and Holly, Michael, and Ty Minshew, who are groundwater modelers in Delaware. And the sort of broad motivation for this whole project has been to better understand what is controlling fast transport of contaminants in groundwater reservoirs, and in particular in the country of Bangladesh. So what I'm showing you here is just a Google Earth image of the Ganges-Brahmaputra Meghna Delta. This is one of the largest deltas and one of the most heavily populated deltas in the world. And the aquifers of Bangladesh are generally hosted in sandstones that are deposited by this deltaic system. And they have had challenges in this country with various contaminants in their groundwater, including naturally derived arsenic and saltwater intrusion, for example. And we are trying to better understand why, in some cases, there are these fast flow transport pathways from contaminated aquifers into sort of what we would have expected to be uncontaminated aquifers. And sort of the angle that I'm coming into this from is trying to understand the connectivity of the sand bodies. And when we think about these delta systems, we can think about the sort of modern surface river networks as the conduits for sediment and for water and for solutes. And these networks build land, and as these sort of surface networks are translated into the subsurface, they form this fairly complex 3D network that then becomes a transport pathway for things like water in this case, or also this is clearly pretty relevant to things like hydrocarbon reservoirs. And so the connectivity of these systems, both the lateral connectivity and the vertical connectivity of these channel sand bodies, depends in large part on the dynamics of these networks. So for example, if you've got these river networks that are laterally migrating, you might form these sort of laterally connected sand bodies that are broad, versus river systems that are undergoing a lot of avulsion. You would be likely to have sort of more of a tendency to have these isolated sand bodies, like you can see in the kind of top schematic panel here, that are the sort of coarse grain sand bodies surrounded by finer grain sediment. And you'll notice that in a lot of this talk, I'm going to really simplify these elements into basically just coarse grain channel fill, and then everything else we're going to assume is finer grained. And I know that is an oversimplification, but that's kind of where we're starting from. So a really useful tool for exploring these kinds of questions of how kinematics of delta systems relates to the sort of subsurface architecture is to use experimental basins. So what I'm showing you here is an experimental delta that was built at the St. Anthony Falls lab. This is actually a delta that was part of a project done by Elisabeth Steel when she was at SAFL, and she was generous enough to let us use her data set. And what you're looking at is a delta that was built over 310 hours of experimental runtime. If you're looking at this time lapse, you'll see that it underwent several base level cycles with sea level fall and rise, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Not totally relevant to this project, but there's a lot of subsidence in the sort of proximal region of this delta, and when you see the stratigraphy, you'll notice there's really high accommodation kind of in the proximal region. But the reason we're interested in this experiment is that they took photos every 10 seconds throughout this experiment. So we have over 100,000 images of the surface of this delta through time. And they also did topographic scans approximately every 4 hours. So we have 124 topographic scans of the system as well. And so we're going to use this data set to sort of ask the question of whether we can use surface information, like the wealth of overhead photos that we have from this experiment, paired with some intermittent scans, less frequent, but occasional topographic scans, to predict the architecture of the subsurface. And one thing that is important to kind of note in this is that we're not trying to exactly replicate the stratigraphy, but what we're trying to do is sort of get at some metrics that matter for reservoirs, like the connectivity of the sand or how much sand there is in a given section. So here's a picture of a slice from that experiment. It's about 2 meters thick and about 6 meters long. And they basically cut this section in dip orientation, which for the purposes of this work is not as useful for us, but it is a really beautiful section. You can see these delta foresets building out, and then you can see that there was really high subsidence in the proximal region of the delta. So what we're going to try to do is sort of try to predict stratigraphy. And if you're going to kind of estimate stratigraphy from surface realizations, there are really two key things you need to know. You need to know where your channels were through time, your channel locations, and then you need to know the bathymetry or the depth of the channel, because this is going to make a difference in terms of how amalgamated those sand bodies are, sort of whether rivers are returning to previous locations frequently and incising into previous sand. And one of the most sort of simple ways you can build this, what we would call synthetic stratigraphy, is to just take your topographic scans and stack them together. And this is something that's been done kind of in the experimental world already. This is an image from a paper by Kyle Straub and Brady Foreman, where they took these topographic scans of a delta. So you're looking at a strike-oriented section here, and they basically just subsided and stacked those scans and allowed them to erode each other. And so you build this synthetic stratigraphy where you can see where the channelized regions are. The thing is that in both natural systems and also in experimental systems, imagery is much more readily available than topography. So it's great when we have really, really frequent topographic scans. But in the real world, we have better control on sort of imagery and things like that than we do actual topography. And then also in experimental settings, it's pretty time consuming to take these topographic scans. You have to stop your experiment. It also requires sort of equipment that is not cheap to do those scans. And so the question I'd like to ask is, how can we use this wealth of imagery to our advantage to sort of fill in some of those gaps that we might have when we don't have topography? So remember, there are basically two things we want to know. We want to know where the channels are and how deep they are. And finding where the channels are through time is not so hard. This is something that's done all the time with imagery, both in experimental and natural settings. And typically what's done is you take a color image like this one up here, which has a red, green, and a blue band, and you can usually threshold that color on one of these color bands. So for example, the water in this experiment was dyed the cyan color. Cyan is the inverse of red in the color spectrum. And so what I'm showing you below is just the red color band in grayscale. And you can see that that red band actually does a really nice job of pulling out the water. But in this set of experiments, one of the challenges we faced was that there is this dark coal sand, which is representative of fine-grained sediment. And in any of the color thresholding we did, that coal sand was pulled out as water, and in some cases very deep water because it was really dark. And so in order to get around this, we actually used principal components analysis to try to extract the river networks from our images. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. PCA is something that's used a lot in data analysis. It was actually new to me to realize that it could be done on imagery, which I think it's kind of an interesting application of PCA. Essentially what it does is it tries to pull out the variance in your data set based on whatever variables you put in. So in our case, we put in the red, green, and blue band from our images, and what comes out are three principal components. I'm happy to talk about this more later, but I'm not going to get into too much detail. The main point is that the first principal component does a really nice job of pulling out variations in the land surface. So you'll see that it really picks up on the coal sediment that's in the surface, and it also just picks up on some of the sort of rough topography on dry land. The second principal component really pulls out the changes between wet versus dry land. So the river network is really highlighted in the second principal component. And the third principal component is just not useful. There's not a lot of information there, so we don't worry about it. And so essentially what you'll see is that I'm using these, the second principal component, the images from that, to extract the river networks from the imagery. And so I've just put a box around this location where you can see there's a lot of coal sand, and there's also some water running through there. And if we were just using the color thresholding, it would pull out that coal sand as very deep water. Whereas PC2, the second principal component, doesn't pick up on the coal sand at all, but it does pick up on some of those sort of thin remnant water that's on the surface there. So we have this method to automatically extract from hundreds of thousands of images very quickly the river networks. The next thing we need to figure out is the depth of the channels. And from imagery, this is the one that's really hard. How can you predict bathymetry from images? This is something that people in the remote sensing field have thought about a lot. Basically, it's very difficult to predict the depth based on imagery because of things like turbidity in the water. And in our case, the water color has only some limited information. This was work done by an honors thesis student who's now a master's student. And she was doing a lot of work looking at basically if we pull into QGIS the topographic scans and the images that were taken sort of close to the time that topographic scans were taken, and we overlay those, are there basically ways we can sort of use conditional probability to estimate the depth? The sort of main point was that this is actually really hard to do. And so sort of what we're left with is basically just a histogram of various channel depths that were measured from this experiment. So you can see here, we've got channel depth on the x-axis. And based on what Hannah measured, we have about, most of the channels are between about 5 and 7 millimeters in this experiment. And so we can just basically use this sort of distribution of channels that are present in the experiment to try to estimate to some extent the depth of the rivers that we're interested in. So essentially one option that we can do, which is sort of like the worst case scenario, like the worst estimate we could make, but we're going to move forward with it and see how it goes, is to basically take our distribution of channel depths and turn it into a cumulative frequency. So this plot on the right is the cumulative frequency of channel depths that have been measured in the experiment based on an overlay between the topography and the images. And what we can do is we can use a random number generator, any random number generator from a normal distribution, which you can find in like Python and MATLAB and all sorts of places, to select a number between 0 and 1. So if we use a random number generator and it pulls out 0.4, we basically take it over to where that curve is and then find the correlative sort of channel depth, which is 4. And then we would say, okay, we're going to just say that this channel probably has a depth of about 4 millimeters. This is a method called an inverse CDF. And it seems maybe a little bit strange to just sort of randomly pick a number and then give it the sort of related channel depth, but you can try this yourself if you take any kind of distribution and you give a cumulative, turn it into a cumulative frequency. And if you were to do this thousands and thousands of times and then replot the distribution of the data that you sort of pulled out this way, it would match the distribution of the original data set. And so this is sort of a statistically valid way to just randomly draw from a distribution. So this is just based on all the channel depths, but we could be a little bit smarter than that. So maybe we look at a river and we're trying to estimate the depth of that river. And we know that it's a wide channel, for example. We can sort of break down our data set into the distribution of depths from narrow channels versus medium channels versus wide channels. So here what I'm showing you is a distribution of all the different channel widths in the system. And we can sort of just break these up. These divisions were done by kind of plotting a bunch of things to see where a natural division between the channel widths would fall. And so what I'm showing you on the right now is the black line is that cumulative distribution that you were just looking at. And then these other lines are basically the CDFs of narrow channels, medium channels, and wide channels. So now what we can do, if we're interested in maybe being a little bit more smart about the way that we want to estimate our channel depth, is we can use a random number generator. And if we know that the channel, for example, is a really narrow channel, we would give it a narrower depth where it hits this CDF. So this is the way that we're going to basically identify where our channels are and then kind of just roughly estimate how deep we think those channels might be. And so in order to build stratigraphy with this method, we're going to take our imagery we're going to take this principal component image that I mentioned, and we can draw a cross-section line wherever we are interested in developing a cross-section through this data set. So for example, if we have a line here, we can essentially use a threshold to define where our channel is, and then we can randomly assign it a depth based on something like the width of that channel. So what you're left with is an extremely simple topographic profile where we basically just have floodplain with no topography, and then we've got this little channel that we give a sinusoidal shape, and then more floodplain. We know we can estimate things like the sedimentation rate, and so we can subside it at a given rate based on how far through the experiment this photo was taken. And if we do this over and over again with successive photos, we start to get something that looks a little bit more like stratigraphy. So we find our channel, we give it a depth, we subside that profile, and then we allow it to erode any underlying stratigraphy that it might be sort of subsiding into or cutting into. And so you start to get something that looks sort of like this. So each one of these lines is pulled from an image. And so if you do this thousands and thousands of times through all of the imagery in this data set, you start to get cross sections that look something like what we have on the right. So what I'm showing you here is a cross section through where this white line is. This is equivalent to about 1.2 meters of stratigraphy, and it's about 5 meters across. And everywhere that you see black here is essentially channel fill, and then everything that's white is just not channel fill, because remember, we're just coarsely defining everything as sort of channel, not channel. So everything here in black would be considered reservoir in our case. And you can see that there's a lot of sand in this system. These experimental deltas tend to be kind of braided deltas, and there's a lot of channel mobility and a lot of sand deposited. You can also see there's some places where we have a lot of floodplain that's preserved, and some cases where we have some isolated sands. So keep in mind that whenever we're generating this synthetic stratigraphy, we are doing this random depth draw from our distributions. And so kind of a natural question to ask would be, how much does that depth draw, or like error associated with that depth draw, change any of the results that we're seeing? And so what I did for each location was I can run many iterations of the same cross section. So each iteration would have a slightly different depth draw for each channel. So what I'm showing you here is the same cross section, just 3 different iterations. And what you can see is that essentially qualitatively, these look almost exactly the same. There are maybe some places where the depth draw makes a little bit of a difference. Like for example, in this yellow box that I've highlighted, you can see here, this channel ended up getting assigned a fairly deep depth. And so maybe there's some connection within that structure. But in general, there's not a lot of, the accuracy of the depth draw is not changing things too drastically. I should mention that this whole code for generating stratigraphy is done in Python, and at this point runs pretty smoothly. So really all you need is just a set of images, some information about what reasonable depths you could expect in this data set, and some information maybe about sedimentation rates. So we can do this, we can sort of look at these sections a little bit more quantitatively to see what kind of information we can pull out from them. And in order to do that, rather than looking at the entire stratigraphic section through the experiment, we're going to break it up based on sea level phase, just because when you're thinking about connectivity and you've got sea level rising and falling, things get a little bit complicated. So this is the sea level that the sort of experimental delta was exposed to. So we have basically a first phase of constant sea level. We then have a slow fall and a slow rise, a little bit again of constant, and then a rapid fall and rise. And then they basically did these sort of superimposed cycles onto a fall and rise. And we're just going to focus on these first parts, partly because these shorter cycles don't generate a lot of stratigraphy, and it just gets actually pretty complicated. So we're just going to focus on some of these earlier sea level phases. So we can just think of connectivity as the area of the largest geobody over the sum of all of the geobody areas. So when I say geobody, I basically just mean like a connected component. So for example, all of this black blob essentially that's here is a single geobody. All of this sand is connected to other sand in that body. You can think of this as if all of the sand in a section was connected to all of the other sand, the connectivity would be 1. or a really low connectivity would be if you had a lot of small isolated sand packages within the system. So one thing to note is that overall there's extremely high connectivity in the system, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Basically what we're looking at here is a cross section of stratigraphy that was generated in this location from A to A prime during the first phase of sea level. So this first constant sea level phase. So now we're just sort of looking at specific sections here. And what I'm showing you here is basically all of the results from this. So we can generate, I'll walk you through this in a minute, but we can basically generate 100 iterations at any location through this delta. And what that allows us to do is to look at the variability based on the depth draw, like how much does the depth draw change our connectivity in the system at a specific location. And then we can also look at things like the connectivity moving up dip to down dip in the system. And so the y-axis on this plot here is connectivity, with one, remember, being like 100% connected, everything is connected. And then the x-axis is downstream distance. So the section I've been showing you in A to A prime is at this location at 175. You can see the numbers along the x-axis to give you a sense of distance, but essentially this is basically proximal in the delta to distal in the delta. And so the first thing to notice is that everything is basically more than 95% connected. Things are really connected in this system, especially in these constant sea level phases. Another thing to notice is this is a box plot. So each one of these boxes encompasses the 100 iterations of the stratigraphy. So you can see that there's not a lot of spread in the data either, which means that basically the changing depth draw of these channels is not affecting the connectivity in any big way, which is good, because what that means is that the way that we're sort of predicting depth is not changing our results in any big way. So this is the same plot that we were just looking at, but for all the different sea level phases. So we've got our constant sea level in the beginning, our slow fall, slow rise, another constant, and then a fast rise. This rapid fall didn't preserve any stratigraphy, it just eroded material, and so we don't have anything preserved from that section. So again, one thing to notice is that with all of these, things are very highly connected. But one thing that I think is kind of interesting is that during the phases of sea level rise, both the slow rise and the fast rise, there seems to be a lot more variability in the connectivity, both as you move sort of from proximal to distal, but also within the individual sections, meaning that in these sea level rise phases, our depth draw is actually changing the connectivity occasionally, meaning that sometimes if you have maybe a shallow depth drawn for a channel, you're losing some connection between two geobodies. It's still not a huge amount of change, like not a huge amount of variation. There's still sort of more than, and for the most part, more than 85% connected. So I would say that it's not anything really drastic, but it is kind of interesting. And I think one thing to think about is that during these sea level rise periods, we're basically getting more aggradation on our delta top, and there's more opportunity for these fine-grained barriers to come in. And so there's more of this interplay between how much those channels can cut through those barriers to form connections between different sand bodies, and sort of how amalgamated things can get.
2 minutes, Elisabeth.
Okay, thanks. So the main takeaway really is that our large scale structure is primarily controlled by channel location. We don't see our sort of having a really accurate depth estimate to be a major factor when we're sort of trying to predict stratigraphy. And that's actually really good news for us, because the depth is the thing that is hardest for us to predict. So as long as we have a reasonable estimate for depth, really what matters is the location of these channels. Some things to consider is that this is a very sandy system overall, and the sands are highly connected. And so something I've been thinking about is that maybe instead of characterizing the sand bodies, we should be characterizing the barriers, the connectivity of the barriers, or even just the shape of them. So even in a highly connected system, if you have these really sort of laterally extensive barriers, you could still be causing changes in flow pathways and traps and things like that. And the last point I want to make is that we have the advantage in this system that we've got this really extensive set of images. And we know that in natural systems, we don't really have imagery going far enough back or even just sort of temporally through systems to see how these channels are moving around through time. And so we haven't had to think about kinematics much in this data set because we can just look at where the rivers are through time. But obviously, if we want to apply this to natural settings, we have to have a better understanding of sort of how rivers are moving and how these networks are deforming through time. And this is something that is a challenge and is sort of an active field of research for a lot of people. And one thing we've been doing is working with Austin Chadwick, who's a postdoc in Minnesota, to use particle image velocimetry to track channel migration. And he's working on sort of using this to distinguish avulsions from lateral migration. So here's a video using the principal component images, and you can see these vector fields that he's generated, which are sort of giving vector fields for the deformation of these channel networks. And so the next steps we're hoping to do are to combine this synthetic stratigraphy tool with the kinematics that he's getting to kind of broaden the picture of how these things fit together. So just to return to this first question of whether we can use surface information to predict certain metrics of subsurface architecture, I would say that it's hopeful because we can use this overhead imagery to constrain lateral and vertical connectivity in the subsurface, and that the large scale architecture does not seem to be very sensitive to local depth measurements. One last thing I'll say too is that we're hoping to get this published soon. Turns out becoming an assistant professor during a pandemic is not a great way to publish papers, but this is going to get out pretty soon, hopefully. And we're planning on publishing the Python code along with it to generate stratigraphy. So part of my hope is that this is going to be a tool that we can apply to, experimental data sets or maybe even natural data sets to sort of get at various connectivity metrics in the subsurface. So with that, I'd like to thank you all. Hopefully the internet stayed and you could hear all the things I said. This is just a list of papers that are like in review from this, except for mine. Mine's not in review yet. But we have a lot sort of coming out, hopefully shortly, about these sort of links between the surface and the subsurface. So stay tuned. Hopefully those will be out this year sometime. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks very much indeed, Elisabeth. I've actually asked for some questions. I can see several points here. This is really good. Question from Mikkel. Very interesting talk, Elisabeth. I wonder about the next steps of this research, like for example, applying it to real satellite imagery, perhaps compare and test this method with several time slices of the same deltaic system, for example.
Yeah, I think one thing that's kind of nice is that once this code is out there, my hope is that it will be like picked up and used in various settings, and like modified by others in some way. I think it would be obviously like the goal is to get it into natural systems and see if we can get it to work in natural systems. Obviously like the pre-processing, like the sort of extraction is going to be a little different, but there are so many tools out there already for extracting river networks and sort of multispectral data and satellite imagery and stuff like that. And so I think that'll be really useful. Part of the reason we sort of started with the experiment was that basically like, if we can't do it with the experiment, then we can't do it in natural settings. But because we can do it in the experiment, then the next question is like, okay, does this actually like work in natural systems? And I think that's where like Austin's work with the kinematics is going to be important. And I know like that there's a lot of work right now trying to quantify kinematics and sort of predict how rivers are moving. And so hopefully like tying those things together will make this more useful. Yeah,
absolutely. Another question actually from Chris Jackson, which kind of builds on from one of my own. Amazing. Would it be possible to generate synthetic seismograms from the synthetic stratigraphy? And that kind of builds on to my question, which is, have you considered taking these observations and this method and comparing it to high resolution seismic data?
That's really interesting. I haven't even thought about it, but I super like that idea. I think the scale that we can, like, we are obviously doing this kind of large scale architecture thing, right? Like we're not getting at like the details of the channel fill. So I think the fact that we are sort of looking at that scale kind of does lend itself to some high resolution seismic, because it's the sort of same problem in seismic, right? Like you're not looking, well, these days, I guess you can look at more detail, but sort of this like architecture scale. So yeah, that's really interesting and something I hadn't thought about, but I think that would be a really fun avenue for sure.
Yep, yep. Several more questions coming here. Thanks from Chris. Bjorn, I'm not surprised that Bjorn commented on this. Hi, Elisabeth. Great talk. Can you explain how you can relate the cross sections to 3D connectivity? Can you generate a 3D map based on broadcasting multiple 2D cross sections, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something we've talked about in our group a lot. The group in Austin are using Delta RCM to do sort of numerical modeling and tackle some similar questions. And for them, it's a lot easier to get kind of they already have like a 3D volume, basically, they can look at. I mean, what I will say is that if things are highly connected in 2D, they are going to be almost entirely connected in 3D, right? Like the connectivity is going to go up in 3D. And it's not, so one of the challenges with just basically taking a bunch of 2D sections and trying to essentially like interpolate between them in order to get kind of like a 3D network is, I think you might end up with some weirdness. This is something we've talked about a lot and trying to think about like if we can even do autoregressive modeling for channel depth, because what you might end up with is a channel. So for each 2D section, we're sort of redrawing the depth. And so you might get these really weird, unreasonable like variations in channel depth along a system. And so one way would be like to sort of try to condition the channel depth on what it is like upstream or downstream. Then you sort of like run into the limit of my abilities as a Python programmer. So I think it would be really interesting. Maybe the depth doesn't change enough to really like matter that much. So maybe that is something that could be done. But what I will say is like, we do think a lot about like 2D versus 3D connectivity. We've been thinking a lot about like percolation thresholds and sort of, for those of you who are like familiar, like basically there's this kind of percentage of sand to mud where all of a sudden things are going to be connected. And in 2D, I can't remember, I think it's like 60% maybe or something like that. And so I think that's some of the stuff that we're seeing in like the sea level rise cases where we've got like more mud and so that ratio changes. I think in those cases, understanding 3D becomes more important, but like, so that's kind of a rambling answer, but I do think it's important.
Okay. I think we better have just time for one more question. It's from Marcelo. It's a great talk. Thanks. How would this apply to non-braided deltas?
I think it would be more interesting, to be honest, in non-braided systems, because I think in these braided systems, like there's so much, you're just getting all sand, essentially. I think actually what would be good is to sort of have these thresholds of like in certain regions, if you're in a very sandy system, like these braided deltas, maybe instead you're characterizing the connectivity and geometry of barriers. But as soon as you get into systems that are non-braided and are more likely to be, have more preservation of floodplain and overbanked deposits, then it starts to become more interesting to characterize the sand bodies themselves. And so there's this sort of like question of like what part, if you're thinking about connectivity, like at some point the barriers become the factor that matters versus the sand. Absolutely. And so I think it would be pretty, I think as soon as you get into like non-braided systems, then you really for sure have to understand kinematics, because it's the sort of lateral movement of these channels is, you just basically don't have like a splattering of channels all over the surface anymore.
Okay. Am I allowed to have one more question? Because it's a good question. Yes. From a question from Benita. It's super interesting. Thanks very much, Elisabeth. The results look to be highly applicable to the ancient and modern fan deltas in the Gulf of Corinth, where there are laterally extensive fine-grained barriers between conglomeratic units, interpreted from high rates of relative sea level rise. And the question really is, what was the sediment supply rate kept the same throughout the experiment, or did you vary it?
It was kept the same. Well, it was supposed to be kept the same.
Right.
There was a little bit of an error in the sediment feeder, which meant that there was a drop in sediment supply about, I think, 3/4 of the way through the experiment, or no, earlier,
Sure.
like the first quarter. So I didn't tackle that very much, but I actually would say that Austin Chadwick has some like pretty interesting results where he's actually trying to use that mistake to help maybe isolate like changes in the migration of the river
Yeah.
from the beginning to the end.
Okay.
But yeah, in general, like they were really the experiment was originally designed to explore the effects of back tilted subsidence on like
Mm.
shoreline response to sea level
Hmm.
change. So they were keeping sediment supply the same, and they were basically just varying sea level.
Okay. Okay. Look, we have to. It's really interesting. Great talk. Thanks for
Thanks.
battling through the all the Wi-Fi challenges you had.
I'm glad it
Um,
worked.